The limestone was cold against Yoshiko's back, pressed so hard her shoulder blades ached. She counted the breathing around her in the darkness. 47 people crammed into the cave's throat, mostly women and children. A few elderly men with hands too gnarled for grenades. 6 days they'd been here, 3 without food. The air tasted like fear and urine, and the sweet rot smell of her cousin's infected foot. Her grandmother's breathing had changed an hour ago. Shallow, rapid. The old woman's right hand clutched the grenade so tightly, Yoshiko could hear the metal creak. The pin was already loose. The sergeant had shown them how before he retreated up the mountain. "When the Americans come," he'd said, his face gray with exhaustion, "use these. They will do things to the women. They will eat the children. Better to die as Japanese than live as their animals." Yoshiko had seen the propaganda posters in school. White demons with fangs and claws. Americans roasting babies over fires. The teacher made them practice the words, Kichiku Bei-e, American and British devils. For 2 years, since she was 10, those words had been as real as her own name. Bootsteps on stone. Close now. Maybe 20 meters from the cave mouth. Her grandmother's knuckles went white. Then, sound Yoshiko had never expected. Laughter. Not harsh or cruel, but light. Almost musical. The dialect was wrong. All wrong. Flowing and strange, and nothing like the guttural barking the posters had promised. A flashlight beam cut the darkness. Yoshiko's breath stopped. The American filled the cave entrance, backlit by afternoon sun. She saw him in fragments. Combat boots caked in red Okinawan mud. Torn uniform trousers. A rifle slung across his back. His helmet cast shadows that made his face hard to read. He swept the flashlight across the cave and the beam caught faces. A mother with an infant. 3 children huddled together. The old men in the back with their useless grenades. The light found Yoshiko. She couldn't look away. The Marine was young, maybe 19. His cheeks were streaked with dirt and what might have been dried blood. His eyes were the color of the ocean on the east side of the island, that impossible blue-green Yoshiko used to watch before the war. They were exhausted eyes, old eyes in a young face. He saw the children. His face did something Yoshiko's 2 years of war preparation had never predicted. It crumpled. Not with anger, with grief. He lowered his rifle. His hands came up, palms out, empty. He said something in English. The tone was soft, pleading. Then he did the impossible thing. He cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears tracking through the dirt on his face while he stood there in full combat gear, looking at enemy children like someone had punched him in the stomach. Yoshiko's grandmother made a sound, a small, confused whimper. Her grip on the grenade slackened. The Marine knelt, slowly, hands still visible. He said something over his shoulder, and 2 more Americans appeared, both looking as young and filthy and exhausted as the first. One of them, a boy with red hair and freckles, looked at the cave full of starving civilians and crossed himself. The first Marine reached into his pack, not for a weapon. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out a brown wrapper. Yoshiko recognized the shape from propaganda. Enemy rations, probably poisoned, definitely inadequate compared to the superior Japanese diet of rice and pickled radish and, for the last 3 months, nothing at all. A chocolate bar, Hershey's, though Yoshiko wouldn't know that name for years. He tore the wrapper. The sound was obscene in the cave's silence. Crinkle of paper and the snap of chocolate breaking into pieces. The smell hit a moment later. Sweet, rich, impossible. The Marine held out the first piece to the nearest child. A boy of maybe 7, so thin his ribs showed like barrel staves. The boy didn't move, frozen in terror or disbelief or both. The Marine kept his hand extended. Patient, his face was doing something strange, smiling and crying at the same time. Like he was offering treasure and apologizing for having it. He said something. The tone was unmistakable. It's okay. Take it. Please. The boy's hand crept forward, took the chocolate, didn't bring it to his mouth, just held it like it might explode. The Marine broke off another piece, offered it to a girl, then another, then to Yoshiko. She took it. The chocolate was warm from being in his pack, pressed against his body. It was the size of her thumb. She stared at it. Enemy poison. American demon food. Certain death. Her grandmother's hand opened. The grenade dropped. It didn't roll. Didn't detonate. Just thudded onto the limestone floor with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Yoshiko put the chocolate in her mouth. The taste erased everything. Every poster. Every lesson. Every word her teacher had screamed about white devils and racial inferiors and the divine superiority of the Yamato spirit. The chocolate melted on her tongue. Sweet and bitter and complicated in a way she had no words for, and she understood with absolute clarity that everything was a lie. You don't give your dinner to something you think is subhuman. You don't cry over something you plan to eat. This boy, this exhausted, filthy, combat-hardened American boy, saw the enemy's children and chose to give them the only food he had. Not because it helped him, not because it won anything, but because somewhere in his brain, underneath the training and the uniform and the rifle, was a reflex that said, "Hungry children, get fed." The chocolate dissolved. Yoshiko felt it in her belly, the first sweet thing in 2 years of bitter. Around her, other children were tasting it too. Small sounds of surprise, of confusion, of reluctant pleasure. The cave filled with the smell of Hershey's chocolate and the quiet sound of a worldview shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The Marine was breaking up a second bar now, then a third. The other Americans were pulling out their rations too, giving them away without hesitation, without counting, without keeping any for themselves. One of them pulled out a canteen and showed a mother how to give her baby water. Another knelt by an old man and said something in English that needed no translation. "You're safe now. It's over." Yoshiko's grandmother was staring at her open hand, the hand that had held the grenade. The fingers that had been ready to kill them all rather than face what she'd been promised would come. She looked at the Marine distributing chocolate to children, looked at her granddaughter's face, chocolate smeared and bewildered, looked at the dropped grenade on the cave floor. Then she did something Yoshiko had never seen her do. She bowed to an American. Deep. Formal. The bow you give to someone who saved your life. The Marine saw it, looked confused. Then, reading the intention if not the custom, bowed back. Awkward in his combat gear, rifle clanking against his helmet, but absolutely sincere. Yoshiko pressed the chocolate wrapper between her palms, smoothed it flat. She would keep it for 70 years. A brown paper rectangle with English words she couldn't read. Physical proof of the moment everything changed. Outside the cave, the war continued. Artillery boomed in the distance, but inside, in the limestone dark, a 12-year-old girl held a chocolate wrapper and learned that the enemy was human. And humans, she discovered, could choose kindness even when cruelty was easier. Especially then. The corpsmen saw them first. The woman and the boy, emerging from the tree line like ghosts. Her kimono was crusted with dried blood. The child in her arms wasn't moving. "Medic!" The shout cut across the field hospital compound. 2 Marines sprinted toward her with a stretcher. She took 3 steps backward, arms tightening around her son. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Shimabukuro Saizen's mother had walked 3 miles with her 9-year-old son bleeding in her arms. She'd stepped over bodies, some Japanese, some American, all equally dead. She'd hidden twice from patrols, certain that discovery meant execution. The Imperial soldiers had been explicit. Americans torture the wounded. They take pleasure in suffering. Surrender is worse than death. But Saizen's leg wouldn't stop bleeding. The mine had taken his left foot and shredded everything up to the knee. She could see bone, After the first mile, he'd stopped crying. After the second, his skin had gone the color of ash. She had no choice left except the one she'd been taught would end in horror. The corpsman reached her. Young, maybe 20. He looked at the boy, and his face went white. "Oh, Christ, ma'am, please." He gestured toward the stretcher, hands open, non-threatening. The universal language of urgency. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her muscles had locked. The second Marine, older, knelt slowly. He made eye contact with her, not the boy. His hands came up, palms forward. Empty. Then he pointed to his own leg, made a rapping motion, pointed to the surgical tent. Trying to communicate, "We can help. Please let us help." She looked at her son's face. His lips were blue. She laid him on the stretcher. They ran. Not jogging, a full sprint, the stretcher bouncing between them. Season's mother followed, her legs moving on their own, carrying her toward the largest tent. Through the open flap, she could see chaos. Marines on tables, blood-soaked bandages piling up, the sharp chemical smell of antiseptic mixing with copper and sweat. A Navy surgeon met them at the entrance. His surgical gown was already stained. He took one look at Season and barked orders she couldn't understand. The corpsman moved with practiced efficiency. Scissors cutting away the boy's torn pants, hands checking pulse points. Someone calling out numbers that meant nothing to her. "Pressure's dropping. I need plasma, now." She watched them insert a needle into her unconscious son's arm. Watched clear fluid begin flowing into his veins. The same plasma bag, she noticed, that hung beside a Marine 2 tables over. Same tube, same technique. They were giving her son American blood. The surgeon was scrubbing his hands, already planning. "Get him stable and into OR2. I need x-rays, but we don't have time. That femoral artery is shredded." He glanced at the Marine he'd been working on, the one with the sucking chest wound. "Williams, can you close for me?" A younger doctor nodded. Just like that, the senior surgeon abandoned an American patient to save a Japanese child. A corpsman guided Season's mother to a spot beside the tent flap. Not out. They let her stay. Let her watch. She stood there, hands clasped, and observed something she had no framework to process. The surgery took 2 hours. Through the gap in the canvas, she watched the surgeon's hands move. Quick. Precise. No hesitation. He tied off bleeders, debrided shredded tissue, reconstructed what the mine had destroyed. A nurse stood across from him, handing him instruments before he asked. Another monitored the plasma drip, but it was the voice that shattered her. "You're doing great, buddy." The surgeon never stopped talking. His hands worked while his mouth offered a steady stream of encouragement to the unconscious child. "Hang in there, champ. Almost done. You're being so brave." The tone was gentle, paternal, the exact cadence she used when Season had fever, when he'd skinned his knee, when he needed comfort, but she had only words to give. This American, this enemy, was speaking to her son the way she did. The vocal pattern of love. She watched him save her son's leg with the same care he'd shown the Marine. Maybe more. He spent extra minutes ensuring the sutures were perfect, that the tissue margins aligned properly. When he finally stepped back, his surgical gown was soaked with sweat. "Get him to post-op. IV antibiotics every 6 hours. I want vitals every 30 minutes. He pulled off his gloves and looked at the nurse. "And find his mother. She should be with him." They didn't make her wait outside. They gave Season a bed, an actual bed with clean sheets, and pulled a chair beside it for her. A corpsman brought her food. Not scraps. A full meal from officer rations. Meat, vegetables, bread. Real coffee. She stared at the tray, unable to touch it. "Ma'am, you need to eat," the corpsman pantomimed, lifting an invisible fork to his mouth. "For your son. You have to stay strong." She ate. It was the first full meal she'd had in 6 weeks. Season woke at dawn. His eyes found her first, then traveled down to his leg. heavily bandaged, elevated, but still attached to his body. His face crumpled with confusion. The surgeon appeared for morning rounds, a metal clipboard in hand. He checked the bandages, the sutures, the drainage tube, nodded with satisfaction. Then he did something extraordinary. He sat on the edge of the bed and addressed the 9-year-old boy in English, knowing perfectly well the child couldn't understand a word. "You're going to be okay, son. That leg's going to heal. You'll walk again. Might have a limp, but you'll walk."
"You're a tough kid." Season stared at him. The surgeon smiled, ruffled his hair, and stood. Before he left, he turned to the mother, made eye contact, bowed. Not a casual nod, a full, respectful bow. She bowed back, deeper, her forehead nearly touching her knees. When she tried to rise, the surgeon's hand was there, gently lifting her up. "Ma'am, you don't bow to us." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. "We're equal. Your gratitude isn't required." 3 days later, a Marine appeared beside Season's bed. Young, sunburned, his uniform still dirty from patrol. He held something behind his back. "Hey, buddy." He grinned at the boy, then revealed his gift, a toy car, carved from shipping crate wood. The wheels were made from flattened tin cans, attached with wire axles. It was crude, but carefully made. The Marine had spent hours on it. He rolled it across the bed toward Season. The boy's face lit up, the first smile his mother had seen since the mine. He grabbed the car, turned it over in his hands, examining every detail with wonder. The Marine watched him play for a moment, then stood to leave. He caught the mother's eye and shrugged, almost embarrassed. Figured the kid needed something to take his mind off things. She understood without translation. This Marine had spent his precious off-duty hours he could have used to sleep, to write home, to simply exist outside of war, making a toy for an enemy child. A child who would never walk normally again because of American ordnance. After he left, she held the wooden car in her hands. It was warm from her son's grip. She thought about the propaganda she'd been fed, about demons and barbarians and savages. She thought about the surgeon's voice, the corpsman's kindness, the toy carved with calloused hands. That night, for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to believe in something beyond survival. She believed in the possibility of mercy. The wooden car sat on the table beside the bed. Outside, the war continued. But inside the tent, something else was happening. Something the Emperor's ideology had no power to stop. A child was healing, and his mother's worldview was dying. Killed by kindness she had no defense against. Nakamura Kenji counted 300 people ahead of him in line. The Ishikawa displacement camp stretched across former sugarcane fields. 8,000 Okinawan civilians packed into a space meant for far fewer. He'd been here 11 days. Living on the thin soup and occasional rice ball the Americans had distributed so far. Starvation rations, exactly as predicted. Exactly as he'd taught his students to expect. The rumble of trucks carried across the field. Kenji straightened. This would be today's humiliation. Another kettle of watery broth. Perhaps some spoiled vegetables. The Americans would make a show of feeding their prisoners just enough to keep them breathing, to keep them useful for whatever labor they'd eventually demand. It was how war worked. How it had always worked. The lead truck turned the corner into the camp's distribution area. Kenji saw the first sack come off the tailgate. 50 pounds, maybe more. Rice. White rice. Not the mixed grains and husks the Japanese military had stretched with sawdust in the war's final months. 2 Marines lifted it like it weighed nothing, carried it to the growing pile near the distribution tables. Then another sack. And another. The second truck held crates. Kenji watched them unload. Canned meat, powdered milk, salt and sugar in quantities that made his throat tighten, medical supplies, bottles of iodine, rolls of clean bandages still in waxed paper. So much food it required a warehouse. They were erecting one now. Marines and Seabees working together, hammers ringing in the humid air. Kenji's hands started shaking. He'd taught mathematics before the war, before the curriculum changed to accommodate imperial loyalty lessons. His mind still worked in equations. He counted sacks, calculated weight, divided by camp population. The numbers didn't make sense. Sensei Nakamura? He turned. Oshiro Fumiko, one of his former students, stood behind him in line. She'd been 16 when the Americans landed, small for her age even then. Now she looked like she'd been carved from driftwood, all sharp edges and hollow spaces. "You taught us they would starve us," she said. Her voice held no accusation, only confusion. "You showed us pictures, prison camps in Manchuria, told us surrender meant slow death." "I taught what I was given to teach," Kenji said, but the words tasted like ash. The line moved. Kenji shuffled forward, watching the distribution process with a teacher's eye for detail. The Marines had set up 4 stations, each with 2 men working, one to hand out rations, one to record names and family numbers. No shoving, no random beatings to maintain order. They'd even put up a canvas awning to provide shade for those waiting. An elderly woman, 3 people ahead, began to struggle with her ration bag. She couldn't have weighed 90 pounds. The bag she'd just been given might have weighed 40. She took 2 steps, stumbled, caught herself against a support pole. Kenji watched the young Marine who'd handed her the ration. 19, maybe 20. Dirt under his fingernails, face burned dark by the Okinawan sun. He wore a wedding ring. Kenji could see it catch the light as the boy vaulted over the distribution table. The Marine reached the old woman in 4 strides. Kenji braced for the inevitable. She was slowing the line. Inefficient. The Marines would have a schedule to maintain, protocols about distribution rates. The boy would bark at her in English, maybe shove her aside to keep things moving. Instead, the Marine smiled. Not a predator's smile. Not the expression of someone asserting dominance. The boy smiled like Kenji's own son used to smile at his grandmother when she needed help carrying vegetables from the market. Warm, instinctive, kind. The Marine took the ration bag from the old woman's hands, said something in English that made her duck her head in embarrassment. He shook his head. No need to apologize, and gestured for her to follow. Then he carried her 40-pound ration bag across the distribution area to the civilian tents, matching his pace to her shuffle, pointing out obstacles in her path. When they reached her tent, he set the bag down carefully, made sure she understood where to go tomorrow for water distribution, then jogged back to his station. The whole interaction took maybe 3 minutes. The other Marines hadn't commented, hadn't rushed him. Treated it like the most normal thing in the world. Stopping your work to help an enemy civilian who had no strategic value whatsoever. Kenji felt something crack in his chest. Next family. Another Marine waved him forward. This one looked older, maybe 30, with corporal stripes on his dusty sleeve. "Name?" the Marine asked through the camp's Okinawan translator. "Nakamura Kenji. Family of 1, the translator spoke. The Marine consulted his list, made a mark, then handed over a ration bag. Kenji nearly dropped it. The weight, 15 pounds, maybe 20. He opened the top. Rice, 2 cans of meat, powdered milk, a small bag of sugar, salt, a tin of coffee. Coffee, real coffee. When had he last seen coffee? "Any medical needs?" the translator asked. Kenji shook his head, unable to speak. "Report to the education tent tomorrow morning if you're interested in teaching," the Marine said through the translator. "They're setting up a school for the children. Need Okinawan instructors who speak Japanese." A school. They were establishing a school in a displacement camp for enemy children. While still fighting enemy soldiers 15 miles south, Kenji carried his ration bag to his tent in a daze. Around him, other civilians wore the same stunned expression. This wasn't deprivation. This wasn't punishment. This was more food than Imperial soldiers received at the front. more than civilians in mainland Japan had seen in months. That night, after eating his first full meal in 3 weeks, Kenji pulled out the teaching materials he'd carried from Shuri when the city fell. Lesson plans about American barbarism. History texts explaining the racial superiority of the Yamato people. Geography lessons proving the divine destiny of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. He'd believed it all, taught it all, drilled it into young minds until they could recite the lies without hesitation. Americans torture prisoners. Americans rape women. Americans are cultural inferiors, racial demons, incapable of civilization. He thought about the Marine carrying an old woman's rice bag. Thought about the surgeon who'd operated on the Shimabukuro boy. Everyone in camp had heard that story by now. Whispered with wonder in the night. Thought about the chocolate bar Miyagi Yoshiko's family wouldn't stop talking about. How the child had kept the wrapper like a religious artifact. The mathematics teacher in Kenji couldn't ignore the equation forming. 10,000 specific lies in imperial propaganda. 10,000 observed acts of American humanity. Which data set deserved belief? He found matches in the bottom of his bag. He'd been saving them, rationing them like everything else. Now he struck one. Watched the flame catch on his lesson plan about American racial inferiority. The paper curled, blackened. He fed it another page. Another. The smoke rose into Okinawa's night sky, carrying 3 years of lies with it. In the morning, Nakamura Kenji would report to the education tent. He would teach again. But this time, he would teach his students to question, to observe, to understand that humanity wasn't a trait limited by race or nation. It was a choice, made or unmade in small moments. Like a young Marine seeing a struggling grandmother and instinctively helping, without calculation, without hesitation. That instinct was worth more than any ideology. The teacher finally understood what he should have taught all along. The Marine's hands were wrong. 6-year-old Kinjo Tsuneko watched them approach her brother and saw immediately they didn't match. Japanese propaganda had shown her pictures, crude drawings of clawed appendages, bestial and savage, subhuman hands on subhuman creatures, lowest of the American demons. Her teacher had spent an entire week on this specific lesson. The black soldiers were animals wearing uniforms, incapable of civilization, bred for violence. The hands reaching toward 10-year-old Masao were broad and scarred, yes, but they moved with a surgeon's precision as they opened a medical kit. Not claws. Human fingers. Masao whimpered, clutching his thigh where shrapnel had torn through. Blood seeped between his small fingers, spreading across his shorts in a widening stain. They'd been running from artillery when the shell hit close. Close enough to throw them both to the ground. Close enough that Tsuneko's ears still rang with a high metallic whine. The Marine knelt. Up close, Tsuneko could see the deep brown of his skin, the dust caked in the creases around his eyes, the quiet exhaustion in his face. 20 years old, maybe 21. He looked at Masao the way their father had looked at them before the evacuation order, before the soldiers gave mother the grenades, before everything became caves and hunger and fear. Easy, son. His voice was low, gentle. Let me see. Masao didn't understand English, but he loosened his grip. The Marine's hands, those supposedly subhuman hands, carefully peeled back the blood-soaked fabric. He didn't grimace at the wound, didn't show disgust. His expression held only concentration, and something else. Something Tsuneko had no word for yet. Compassion. He pulled items from the kit with practiced efficiency. Sulfa powder first, dusted directly into the wound. Masao flinched, but the Marine's free hand rested on the boy's shoulder. Steady, reassuring. Then gauze, clean and white, pressed firmly against the bleeding. His movements were economical, rehearsed. How many wounded had these hands treated? How many times had he done this exact thing while mortars fell and rifles cracked? And then he began to sing. The sound froze Tsuneko completely. It was a lullaby. She knew this without understanding the words. The melody rose and fell with the same gentle rhythm her mother had used when fever made Masao cry in the night. The same cadence, the same soothing tone that said, "You're safe now. I'm here. You're going to be okay." The Marine's voice was beautiful. His hands worked in time with the song, wrapping gauze, tying it secure, checking circulation in Masao's toes with fingers that moved like water. Completely, perfectly, impossibly human. The cognitive dissonance was too extreme. 3 years of education stated one reality. Her eyes showed her another. The equation couldn't balance. Masao had stopped crying. He watched the Marine's face with the same confusion Tsuneko felt. The song continued, soft and steady, as the bleeding slowed. The Marine pulled out a canteen, unscrewed it with one hand, and helped Masao drink, and water splashed over the boy's chin. The Marine smiled, not the predatory grin of propaganda posters, but something warm and genuine. "There you go, champ." He ruffled Masao's hair. Tsuneko felt something break inside her chest. Not shatter. That implied violence. This was gentler, like ice thawing. 3 years of carefully constructed hatred, melting. She thought of the other moments, the ones that had accumulated like drops filling a bucket until the weight became undeniable. The cave, 8 days ago. Yoshiko Miyagi's whispered story of the chocolate bar, shared in the darkness while they waited for artillery to stop. The Marine who cried when he saw the children, who gave his dinner to enemies. The field hospital tent Shimabukuro's mother described, her voice thick with wonder. The surgeon who worked for 2 hours to save a 9-year-old enemy's leg, using the same tools he'd use on Americans, speaking encouragement to an unconscious boy who couldn't understand the words but might have felt the love. The food distribution yesterday. Tsuneko had watched a young Marine help an elderly woman carry a 50-pound rice bag, treating her like family. More food than the Emperor's soldiers ever saw, given freely to captured civilians who had zero strategic value. And now this. A black Marine, specifically taught as subhuman in every lesson, singing a lullaby while bandaging her brother with hands more gentle than any she'd seen since their father disappeared. 1 moment might be performance. 2 might be coincidence. But this was something else entirely. This was pattern. This was culture. This was a kind of humanity that operated on reflex, not strategy. The Marine finished securing the bandage. He pulled something from his pocket, a wrapped candy, red and white striped. He placed it in Masao's palm and closed the boy's fingers around it gently. "For being brave," he said. Masao stared at the candy, then at the Marine's face, then back at the candy. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Tsuneko understood. What words existed for this? How did you thank someone for disproving everything you'd been taught about the world? The Marine stood, adjusting his rifle sling. He looked at Tsuneko for the first time, really looked at her, and his expression softened even further. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a second candy, held it out. Tsuneko took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but the gesture bridged something vast. She clutched the candy the way Yoshiko clutched her chocolate wrapper, knowing somehow this moment would matter for the rest of her life. The Marine nodded once, then moved on to the next group of civilians waiting for medical attention, his hands already reaching for his kit, his voice already starting another soft song. Still human, still gentle, still destroying, with every act of kindness, the ideological foundation that made the war possible. That night, in the civilian tent, Tsuneko unwrapped the candy slowly. Peppermint. The taste was sharp and sweet and completely foreign. Masao sat beside her, his bandaged leg elevated on a folded blanket an American nurse had provided. He sucked his candy, eyes distant. "He sang to me," Masao said quietly. "I know." Why would he do that?
Tsuneko considered. Around them, other children slept on actual cots, provided by Americans. Overhead, electric lights, powered by American generators, hummed softly. Outside, American sentries walked perimeters not to keep them in, but to keep them safe. I think, she said slowly, working through it. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a hurt child. And his culture, maybe. It made him want to help. But Sensei said, Sensei was wrong. The words came easier than expected. About everything. Masao nodded. He'd reached the same conclusion through different math. The surgeon's hands, the food rations, the Marine's song, the accumulated weight of evidence against propaganda's single narrative. The candy dissolved on Tsuneko's tongue. Sweet, real, offered freely by a man who was supposed to be a demon, but turned out to be the most human person she'd encountered since the war began. She thought about the school tent the Americans had opened 3 days ago. Actual lessons. Actual teachers. They were teaching enemy children to read while fighting enemy soldiers 15 miles south. The contradiction was too stark to ignore. Propaganda had spent 3 years constructing an image of Americans as savages. That image couldn't survive a lullaby sung over a wounded boy by hands that healed instead of harmed. Tsuneko wrapped the candy wrapper carefully, smoothing its creases. She would keep this, maybe forever, not as a souvenir, but as proof, evidence that the world could be different than what you were taught, that humanity was a choice. And some people, even enemies, chose it reflexively. Outside, the war continued. But inside the tent, surrounded by children receiving better medical care than Japanese soldiers ever got, sleeping on cots provided by people who had every reason to hate them, Tsuneko felt something new growing where hatred used to live. Not quite trust, not yet, but possibility. The first fragile shoots of it, fed by a Marine's song and a peppermint candy, given to a 6-year-old enemy who would remember this moment for 70 years. The kindness wasn't strategic. It was cultural, and it was winning a war propaganda could never touch. Yoshiko's hands shake as she folds the wheelchair. Her grandson reaches to help, but she waves him off. Still independent at 82, still stubborn. The morning sun hits the Peace Memorial's black granite walls. Names appearing like stars emerging at dusk. American names, Japanese names, Okinawan civilian names. 24 meters of equal remembrance. She pulls the photograph from her purse. The edges are soft as cloth from 7 decades of handling. Protected in plastic now, but the crease down the middle remains. The fold line from when she kept it hidden in a textbook during the American occupation. Then in a jewelry box. Then finally framed on her living room wall after her husband died. "Obasan," her grandson says, "you've never told me about this picture." A young Marine kneels in dirt, his uniform filthy, his face gaunt with exhaustion. Around him, 6 children sit cross-legged, holding something small in their hands. The girl second from the left is skeletal, her eyes enormous in a face that shows every bone. Her mouth is open. Mid-bite, Yoshiko knows, though the photo's grain obscures the detail. That girl is tasting chocolate for the first time in 3 years. That girl is her. His name was Michael, or Matthew, or maybe Martin, she says. I never learned which. The M sound. I remember that. One of the other Marines said it. She touches the Marine's face in the photograph, her fingertip against the protective plastic. He cried when he saw us in the cave. A warrior, weeping for enemy children. The grandson shifts his weight, uncertain how to respond. He's 17, born into a world where Okinawa hosts American bases and elderly women speak English learned in occupation schools. The war is history class, distant as feudal battles. Yoshiko walks toward the wall. Her cane taps against granite. You asked me to come here? The boy says carefully. Why today? 70 years, she says. April 15th, 1945. The day I learned everything I'd been taught was a lie. She stops at a section of American names, runs her finger down the engraved letters, searching. Always searching, though she knows the probability approaches 0. The Marine was 19. She learned that from the translator who came 3 days after the cave. 19 in 1945 means 89 now if he survived Okinawa at all. If he survived the next 70 years of life that follow any war. Tell me, the grandson says. So she does. The cave. 6 days underground. 47 people in a space meant for 20. The air thick with waste and fear, and the particular smell of starvation. Sweet, chemical, wrong. Her grandmother's hands on the grenades. Knuckles white, lips moving in silent prayer to ancestors and gods. Use them when the demons come, the imperial soldiers had said. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. They were retreating. That word was forbidden, so they called it strategic repositioning. And they gave grenades to civilians like parting gifts. The Americans eat children. They rape women and make soup from infant bones. Die with honor. Die Japanese. The sound of boots on stone. American voices. She knew the language from school, though her teachers had taught her only words of contempt. Devil tongue, they called it. The barking of apes. But the voices sounded young, tired, almost musical in cadence. The flashlight found them. The Marine was a boy, 19, but looking younger in the harsh beam. Dirt streaked across his face like war paint. He saw the children first. His rifle dropped to his side, hanging from its strap. His face did something Yoshiko had never seen a soldier's face do. It crumpled. He cried. Standing there in full combat gear, weapon at his side, he put his hand over his mouth and wept. Jesus Christ, he said. Then again, Jesus Christ. Another Marine appeared behind him, then a third. They were speaking rapidly, checking the cave, Yoshiko understood later, making sure no soldiers hid among the civilians. But their voices stayed soft, their movements careful. The first Marine knelt, reached into his pack. Yoshiko's grandmother pulled the pin on one grenade, ready to throw, and withdrew not a weapon, but a brown wrapper, a Hershey's chocolate bar. He broke it. The snap echoed in the cave's silence. Broke it again. Pieces in his palm. Extended toward the children. Yoshiko stared. Chocolate. Real chocolate. The last she'd seen was her 8th birthday, before the war consumed everything. It's okay, the Marine said in English, his voice cracking. You're safe now. You're safe. She didn't understand the words. She understood the tone, the same voice her father had used when she woke from nightmares, back when fathers still came home. She took a piece, put it in her mouth. The taste exploded. Sweet, rich, impossible. Her stomach cramped immediately. Too long without food, the richness a shock. But she didn't care. She was tasting proof. Proof that he was human. That they were human. That everything, the lessons, the propaganda, the grenades clutched for noble suicide, was a lie. Her grandmother looked at the chocolate in Yoshiko's hand, looked at the Marine's face, still wet with tears, looked at the grenade in her own grip. She dropped it, just opened her hand and let it fall. It hit the cave floor with a soft thud, pin still in, harmless now. The other grenade followed. Then she bowed. Deep. Formal. The bow reserved for emperors and ancestral altars. The Marine didn't understand. He looked panicked, actually. Gestured for her to rise, his hands fluttering in confusion. But she held the bow until he finally, awkwardly, bowed back. The wrapper stayed in Yoshiko's pocket for 3 days. Then, in a drawer. Then in a frame. 70 years of preservation. This scrap of waxed paper proof that humanity could survive ideology. I joined the Okinawa America Friendship Society in 1953, Yoshiko tells her grandson, still running her fingers down the memorial wall's names. 42 years, I served as director. We hosted reunions, exchanges, cultural programs. I met 187 American veterans. Not one remembered our cave specifically. So many caves, so many civilians, all blurring together in memory. You were looking for him, the grandson says, understanding now. Always, she smiles. I wanted to tell him what his chocolate bar did, that it saved 47 people, not just from starvation, but from dying hating. That grandmother lived to 93 and spent her final decades teaching Ikebana to Marines' wives at Kadena. That I became a teacher myself and spent 35 years making sure Okinawan children learned Americans were human beings, not demons. She pulls flowers from her bag, chrysanthemums, white and yellow, divides them into 2 bouquets. I wanted him to know his kindness multiplied, that Shimabukuro Seizen, the boy who lost his foot, became a translator and built medical exchange programs. That Nakamura Sensei, who taught us to hate, spent 40 years teaching students to question propaganda. That Kinjo Tsuneko wrote 3 books about the Black Marine who sang to her brother, specifically challenging the racial lies we'd been fed. The first bouquet goes at the base of the American section. The second at the Okinawan civilian section. Equal portions, equal honor. That Marine gave his dinner to enemy children, she says. Probably his only chocolate for weeks. He gave it because... She pauses, searching for words. Because kindness was reflex, not strategy, not propaganda. An American boy saw hungry children and fed them without thinking twice. That's what you wanted to tell him? That and this. She touches the memorial wall. That his chocolate bar saved my life twice. Once in 1945 from starvation. And every day since, from hatred. The grandson is quiet. Then, do you think he knew what he was doing? Yoshiko considers. I think he saw children and responded the only way his culture taught him to respond. With compassion. The Japanese military gave my grandmother grenades and told her to kill us. His military gave him chocolate and he chose to share it. That's not individual virtue. That's cultural instinct. She sits on the memorial bench, suddenly tired. The photograph rests in her lap. Your generation asks why we don't hate Americans, she says. Why Okinawa accepts the bases. The cultural exchange, the complicated peace. This is why. She taps the photo. We remember what they did when they could have done anything. When we were defeated, defenseless, dehumanized by our own propaganda. They treated us like human beings. Fed us better than our own military fed us. Operated on our children with the same care they gave their own wounded. Built schools. Distributed food. Gave toys to kids who'd thrown rocks at them days before. The emperor called for death with honor, her grandson says quietly, reciting history class. The Americans gave us life with dignity, Yoshiko finishes. 70 years later, I know which one was civilization. The sun climbs higher. Tour groups begin arriving. School children in uniforms, foreign visitors with cameras. Yoshiko watches them mill around the memorial, pointing at names, reading plaques, learning. She hopes they understand. Not just the history, but the lesson underneath. That kindness toward enemies isn't weakness. It's the ultimate strength. It's what actually wins peace. A young American couple approaches, cameras around their necks. The man's ball cap reads USS Abraham Lincoln. Navy, likely stationed at Kadena. He sees Yoshiko's bouquets, her age, the photograph in her hands. Ma'am, he says in careful Japanese, were you here? During the battle. Yoshiko looks at him. 25 maybe. The same age as that long-ago Marine would be now, if time ran backwards. She holds up the photograph.
"This is me," she says in English. Perfect English, learned from occupation teachers, refined across decades. That's an American soldier.